Okay, my name's Justin. My surname is actually Slack. I get asked that a lot. I have nothing to do with a messaging app, although I should have bought that domain long ago. So my topic today is on fonts on the web, past, present, and future. And we'll cover four main things, which is, fonts, past, where have we been, where are we now, what can we do with what we call rich typography or OpenType features, and then how should we be loading fonts for performance, and then the future of fonts on the web. Okay, so we go back to 1991, which is not that long ago, but in 1991 there was only one website, and it was at CERN, and it was built by, any ideas? Tim Berners-Lee, right, who pretty much invented the web. Has anyone seen this website? No? It's amazing. It looks like that. Okay, so that was 1991. That was the very first web page. Those links all work. This is now hosted at CERN on their website as a historical archive, an artifact. And if you look at it, there's no design really, except what was default in browsers, which is color, font sizes, blue links, which are still the default. And anyone hazard a guess what that font or typeface is? It's Times New Roman, yeah. So we still have that as a legacy. If you put some HTML into a page and you open it up in your browser and you don't declare any styles for that, it's going to render in Times New Roman. So that was the first web page. And that was the first font that was used for that is one that we still have as our default serif font on the web. Okay, sorry, let me just go back to full screen. It's a little bit fiddly. Okay, so that was the first website. But in the 1990s, around the same time, type on the screen was making important strides. I mean, previously typefaces had mostly been used in print, and they'd been done in various ways. But there weren't really any typefaces that were designed for the screen. They were all designed for print, and they looked very different. They had very different characteristics. Microsoft started something called Core Fonts for the Web in 1996, which was a very important initiative, and it was an initiative to start designing typefaces that were made specifically for use on the screen. And that gave us a lot of typefaces that are still in use today. Arial, for one, which was kind of a copy of Helvetica. No, let me not say a copy, it's very similar. Verdana, Georgia as an alternative to Times New Roman, and amongst others, everyone's favorite, Comic Sans. So those all started in 1996 by Microsoft, and they changed the way that fonts were designed for the screen and how they looked. At the same time, we had a really slow adoption of CSS. CSS was first proposed in 1994. And a standard was adopted in 1998, which was CSS1, and that had basic typography features in it, so you could change the colors of your fonts and so on. But there wasn't much support for it until around 2000. And there was one browser in 2000 that supported the entire CSS1 spec, including all the typographic features, and it was Internet Explorer 5, but it was Internet Explorer 5 for Mac. And coincidentally, it was also the very last version of Internet Explorer that was ever released for the Mac. But it was the first one to support proper CSS. A lot of people rail on IE, but there was a lot of good stuff happening in the early days. Yeah. Right, and then there was this other weird thing happening called the font wars. I didn't make that term up. People actually talk about the font wars. There's a Wikipedia page, so it must be real. And what those were contesting formats. Yeah. So there was a lot of contestation around what format should we be using for our typefaces and our fonts. And there were a number of ones that were proposed by the big digital players at the time, which was Apple, who had what they called Apple Advanced Typography. Apple were the first serious players to release a typeface that wasn't just made of dots or bitmaps, okay, and that was actually vector-based. And that happened fairly early on. That was Apple Advanced Typography. There was Adobe, who were pushing for what they called Type 1 or PostScript. and PostScript became kind of the dominant font for the screen in the 90s. Microsoft and Apple were collaborating. These things used to happen on something called TrueType, which was another font format, which is still around. You might see a TTF extension on one of your font files. That's a TrueType format. And then there was OpenType, or OTF, which was a collaboration between Adobe and Microsoft. So all these competing things were happening around the same time. And this is important because it brings us to where we are now and what we can do with type because of the format that we use for that. And the format that won out in the end was OpenType. So why did OpenType win out? So OpenType improved on PostScript, which was its predecessor in a number of ways. The most significant one is that one OpenType font file can contain over 65,000 characters or glyphs. So this means that you can get a whole lot of information into that. Whereas previously, a PostScript file was limited to 256 characters in one file. In PostScript days, if you wanted to have a full font family, it could take you up to over 100 megabytes just to have all the different weights and styles, because you needed to have so many files just to characterize that. Whereas OpenType got rid of that. We can put all this in one file and get rid of those problems. Right, so we have extensive language support in an OpenType file. You can have multiple languages. So we can have English, for example. We can have Cyrillic languages. We can have Asian languages, all in one font file, and just enable them via special characters. And we can have advanced typographic features. And those are what are called OpenType features. And they give us a whole lot more options in our typefaces than what we might normally just see. And I'll talk about those a bit later. So fonts in the browser, if you are a dev or you write CSS of any kind, you may have done something like this. HTML on your HTML page, and then giving it a specific language. In this case, this would be language English. Who doesn't do this? It's a problem if you don't. If you don't specify your language, then you lose certain things when you maybe move between languages. So if you just have HTML, it defaults to English, and you have something that's in a Germanic text, you're not going to get the correct punctuation available to you because you haven't declared those language. So that's our first step in typography. It doesn't happen in the CSS, it doesn't happen in the font files we're using, it actually happens in the HTML. And this is often overlooked because it's an easy thing to overlook. Right, then if we're doing CSS, we may use something called font face. Familiar? Anyone used font face before? Okay, so font face is a CSS property which allows us to tell the browser which fonts we wanted to use. And these are fonts that are over and above what we might call web-safe fonts that we can assume are on people's operating systems like Times New Roman, Georgia, Arial, Verdana, etc. So for a custom font, the very first browser that supported custom fonts was Netscape Navigator 4. If you're old like me, you used this in 1994. Okay. Netscape became Mozilla, became Firefox, etc. And they were the very first ones to support that via this embedded HTML. So in the head section of your document, you would create a link, you'd make a relationship for that link. The relationship would be something called font def, and the source would be whatever your font was called with an extension called PFR. And then when you wanted to use that font, you would wrap your type in a font tag and then specify by the face attribute what that font would be. And you had to do that for every single bit of text that you wanted to use that particular typeface. That wasn't a lot of fun, so people tended not to do it. This also only worked in Netscape. It didn't work in any other browsers, well, IE being really the only one around at that time. If you wanted to make this work in Internet Explorer, you had to install a plugin, which would then prompt you to refresh the page whenever you visited it. And that was really painful to do stuff like that. So, in the 90s, the late 90s and the early 2000s, we often had websites that you would visit them and it would say best viewed in this browser for some of these reasons. Or you would go to a landing page and it would say, please click here for the Netscape version of the site or click here for the Internet Explorer version of the site. Because IE also supported font face and has done so since 1997. So IE supported font face forever. It's always been available. for use in Internet Explorer. And here's proof. This is from Browser News. You can see it's a very modern website. Tuesday, September the 22nd, 1997. And in that, we have embedded fonts in Microsoft IE4 version 2. And the article then says what they are. And there's a link. And this link, this is a screenshot, but this link is still on the web archive. And you can actually go and have a look at what Internet Explorer 4 was doing in 1997 with custom typefaces. So as I say, IE gets a lot of flack, but they were doing a lot of good stuff early on. So to use FontFace, you would declare this in your style sheet, in your CSS file, with the @FontFace property. You would then specify what is my font family, and then you would specify a source via a URL, which works the same way as any other URL you say in CSS, like an image or something in a pseudo element or something like that. And then you would simply say, and then you would just reference that particular font family whenever you wanted to use it. You'll notice there that it says EOT. That stands for Embedded OpenType. And this was a proprietary font format that only worked on Internet Explorer and didn't work on Netscape. So you had these two competing technologies, the font wars, as I already alluded to. So you could make it work in one browser, but it wouldn't work in another. Right, then we got something called WOFF. Has anyone heard of WOFF? Yes. Web Open Font Format. And this was proposed and developed by Mozilla in 2009, and it was adopted as a standard by the W3C in 2012, and in 2015 we got WOFF version 2, which reduced the file size of WOFF by 30%. Now what WOFF is it's a compressed version of a font file. It is an OpenType font file that I mentioned earlier, with all those 65,000 glyphs and characters available to you, but in a much smaller size. Okay. So the very first version, WOFF, reduced the font size significantly, and WOFF 2 has done even more so to that. So they really are quite small. So that's the format that we're now using on the web. But early on, with FontFace, we had to write this complicated, horrible CSS, where you'll note something here called IE_fix, which would make an embedded OpenType font work in IE. You would then load a WOFF, you would load a TrueType for other browsers, and you wrote an SVG for early versions of Apple's iOS operating system, which used SVG fonts for some arcane and weird reason that no one understands. Fortunately, nowadays, we don't really need to do this. This was specifically for Internet Explorer 8. If you've never had to work with Internet Explorer 8, then you are fortunate. I have had to, and we needed to do this complicated font face for to make things work in IE. And while most browsers would only download the font, that file that they're going to use, so for example, in this case, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, and Opera would download the WOFF file and ignore the others. IE would download all of them, even if they weren't being used. So it was a massive performance problem. Yeah. So IE, just to show a typeface, IE would download 5 font files, even though only one was being used. Nowadays, we don't need to do that. We can just reference our WOFF 2 because of browser support. And then if we do need to support Internet Explorer 11, which if, like me, you work in any financial services of any kind, you need to, you put that afterwards. Okay. And that will allow these fonts to work in any browser. Okay, so, sorry, we missed a thing here. So OpenType features. Okay, so WOFF and FontFace allows us to put these custom fonts in our browsers, and then we can use CSS OpenType features to improve and enhance our typography. Has anyone ever used OpenType features or aware of them? No, okay. So what are they? So there are more than 100 OpenType features, and these are features that are built into a particular typeface or font file. You won't find all of them in every font file. The type designer will decide which ones he or she would like to include. And we should just care about important ones at the right times. And I'll show you a few examples of that. So there's a whole bunch. Like you may have heard of some of these things. Kerning, that's spacing between individual letters, ligatures, contextual, stylistic alternates, and so on and so on. So let's have a look at one example, and that's ligatures. Yeah. So most browsers nowadays actually turn ligatures on by default. Okay? If a font has a ligature, it's not going to ask you to do anything to show it. It's just going to show by default. And that has advantages and disadvantages. So this is a blurb, and this is exactly how it is and what it looks like and the size and everything from my company's website. A specialist financial services software development company. There are 2 ligatures here. Any idea what they might be? Yes?
F and I in financial and the
Correct.
T in software.
Correct. So those are ligatures. You'll see there that letters are joined together. And they're letters that would normally collide into each other, right? So an F has got a cross, and then an I has got a dot, and if they're too close together, they become really, they just don't look good, right? And the same with the F and the T, they both have crosses. So if they're too close together, they look strangely joined, which obviously you don't want. Yeah. So those are just enabled by default in the browser. Okay. That's a screenshot that I took directly from the website. But I really hate that ligature. It's really terrible. Yeah, it looks awful, in my opinion. But that one's okay. So I quite like that. So what we can do is we can target ligatures in CSS. So we can, for example, we can say, in our CSS, let's use this property called font variant ligatures, and let's say common ligatures. And that will turn it on. Or we have what's called a low-level CSS property for browsers that don't support the high-level one, and that's called font feature settings. And OpenType features are always a 4-letter acronym. In this case, liga is ligature, and clig is common ligatures. Okay. And that's how you target OpenType features in your CSS. So what we actually do is this. We just keep that one, and we wrap a span around the F and I and turn off the ligature there because it's really not very nice. Okay. So you can really improve your typography by using OpenType features, but use them in a contextual way. Yeah, you don't want to just go and put them all on and hope that everything turns out okay, because that's often not the case. So that's our F and I. That's a bad phrase. In financial, rather without the ligature, because it looks a lot better, in my opinion. Okay, so what can we actually do with these? So HTML tables, right? For a long time we used HTML tables for layout. We don't do that anymore, hopefully. But we do use tables for tabular data because that's what they're for. And I work in financial services, so we have a lot of tabular data. And we need to display that tabular data. And sometimes we have really big numbers. Sometimes I question the worth of showing these big numbers, but we are required to do so anyway. And big numbers are hard to read, right? So I've just made a simple table. It's not a real, it's just an example. So if you look at that, you can see there's a table, there's my table, it's got all the things you want, etc., etc. But look at that number. What's remarkable about that number other than its size? Yeah, so you'll see the descenders, which is the 7s, they go below the baseline. Okay. So they're matching other letters in this font that have a descender, like a Y or a G. They're matching that height. Okay. And that makes it really hard to read. So you see a number like a 5, it's quite similar to a G, so it's mimicking the height of the G in the font. So this is a font that's called Freight Sans Pro. It's a very nice font, except for those numbers. But OpenType features allow us to fix those numbers through something that we call proportional lining. So I'm just going to turn this on and keep an eye on those big numbers, and you can see how they look now. And they are now all in equal height, and they are the same width as well. So that makes it much, much easier to read. And that's just one example of what we can do with OpenType features in our typefaces. Particularly good for numbers, as they can make them far more readable. And there are all sorts of OpenType features that relate to numbers, like fractions. You can create a fraction in HTML by using a special character, but you're kind of limited to a half and a 3/4, a third and 2/3 kind of things. Not any type of fraction, but fractions are an OpenType feature. So in this case, I just write 3/4, wrap a span around it, and I have, with OpenType features, an actual and proper fraction, okay, which is very nice to use, much easier to read. Yes?
Is it the same shape, just size to fit, or is it a new?
It's a new glyph altogether, yeah.
That's the way.
Yeah. Okay, then something else we can look at, like things that are really hard to read are abbreviations, because they're usually in capital letters, right? And capital letters are always going to be taller than your standard lowercase letters. So for that, we have something called small caps. And if you keep an eye on that DML, you'll see there small cap will make it the same height as all the other letters. And again, super easy and readable. We also have stylistic sets. So a typeface with OpenType features can actually have a whole range of variations of the letters and numbers and punctuation within that font. Some of them go up to 20 different stylistic sets. Some will have none. It all depends on the type designer. So I'm going to turn the stylistic set on and just keep an eye on the G and the A, or the G's and the A's in that heading, and you'll see when I turn the stylistic set on, they're actually going to change completely. So you can see now we have an open G and an open A, as opposed to closed G and closed A. And open letters are much, much more legible and easier to read than closed ones. So with this typeface, this is still Freight Sans, a nice option to do is on a headline would be to put on that stylistic set, because you're making it much more readable at big, bold sizes, which is very nice. And then there's alternates. I just did this for, a laugh, because alternates is like, let's just replace all the letters with whatever things we want. And there are all sorts of shapes, arrows, triangles, etc. And you can see it's totally different. And that's called an alternate. Yeah. So you could use those as well. If you know what the letter is that maps to the triangle, for example, you can use that. I don't recommend it, though. It's not very accessible. Okay, so those are OpenType features. I've only shown a few examples. As I say, there are over 100. And we can use many of them to really improve the way we do type.
Sorry, how do you? For example, that last one. What does that look like in the span or in the class?
The alternates.
Yeah, with the actual code to do.
Do you want to see the code? Okay, sure. So let's just have a look at this. So, is that legible? Not really. How's that? So see, when I turn this on, font feature settings, small caps. Okay? So that's how we enable them. Okay, so that's all great, nice, rich typographic features. We can make all these great things, but they come at a cost, and the cost is performance. Yeah. Fonts are already a problem with performance, and once you add OpenType features to a font, then the font size, the file size gets bigger. So, like Google Fonts, for example, they strip out OpenType features to keep the size down. So you're only going to get like maybe ligatures and kerning. You're not going to get any of those things I showed you in a Google font, because they take them out. That doesn't mean we shouldn't use them, because there are lots of strategies we can use for performance. So font loading. Before a browser shows you a web font, it needs to be downloaded over the network, right? So your font needs to reach you before it can be used, and then it needs to also pass the CSS and find the font family declared in that CSS file before it's even going to show it. So it's quite a process. So it can cause serious performance issues, particularly if you have like 8 typefaces. And you might see something like this, which is called a flash of invisible text. My page is loaded, my text is actually there, the browser's painted it white, and all I can see are like bullets and underlines and things like that, because my font file hasn't downloaded yet. Or you might get something where you see good old Times New Roman, and then a little bit later you see a different typeface, and that's called flash of unstyled text. So we show a fallback font, and then we load in our custom font. So what can we do for all of this? Well, don't use custom fonts as your first option. Just use Arial or whatever. It's allowed. You can actually set up a font family like this, which targets pretty much in a foolproof way any font that you might find on an operating system as the default. Okay, starting with Apple and ending with Helvetica Neue, which is old versions of Macs, and then just a sans serif as a fallback, which is likely to be Arial. So you can just go that way. Like GitHub, for example, does that. If you visit on a Mac, you see the Apple system font. If you visit on Windows, you see the Windows system font. I don't know what that is. But they are different. Yeah. The other thing you can do is minimize downloads. So you can say in your font face, well, is this font installed on this user's machine? So you can add the local attribute there, and it'll first go and check if it's installed. And if it is, it's going to use the one on the machine and not bother to download it. So that's a very nice thing to do. But the chances of that happening are quite slim, unless you're using a really, really well-known font. You can download even less. So you can specify a Unicode range. So you can say, okay, don't load the entire font. I only want the lowercase letters and the numbers 1 to whatever. If you are using all caps headers, for example, and that's only from one typeface, don't download all the lowercase letters as well, or the numbers that you might not need. And you can cut down your size like that. You can download earlier using something new, which is relatively new, which is preload. So this goes in the head of your document, of your HTML document, and you say download this as a font of type, and make sure it's cross-origin so we don't have any browser blocking issues. And instead of waiting for the CSS, this will start downloading the font files as soon as you hit that HTML page. As soon as you hit a URL, it'll start to download your font files. You can use this for JavaScript and CSS as well. It's not strictly for fonts, as long as you just say as what it is. Patchy support at the moment, mostly only Chrome, but it will come to other browsers soon. And it's progressive enhancement, right? It's not going to hurt to put it in. If a browser understands it, that's great. If it doesn't, it doesn't matter. Then you can go the JavaScript route by using the font loading API, which is unfortunately not supported in a lot of places, but there's this thing called the font face observer that uses that. And we just set up a font face observer with our font family, and then we say, well, don't show a fallback font until my font is loaded, and it listens to that. It works with promises in JavaScript, so it says, I promise to give you this font file. While that's happening, add this class to my HTML, and then we swap out our font families in our CSS in a way like that. I'm very wary about using JavaScript to solve what is a CSS problem. So this is a way to do it. There are caveats though. It uses promises, so you've got no Internet Explorer support at all because there's no promise support in IE. You can polyfill that, but polyfills come with their own problems. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Another thing you can do is data URIs, where you would just convert your font into a data URI and literally embed it in your CSS file. Okay, so you never have to download a font file. It's already in your CSS. That, of course, makes your CSS file a lot bigger than it might necessarily be. This is very fast. You get really good results from this, but at the expense of things like caching, because you put it in the head, right? You don't put it in your style sheet. you see that style is not sitting as an external file, it's sitting in the head section of the HTML, and that means it's tricky to cache. Okay. Fortunately, we have a CSS solution to this problem, and that is a new property called font display. And font display sets up a timer when you hit a URL, and once it starts to download something, then it gives you a few timing settings. So we have a number of periods here, and we have a block period where it says, okay, don't download the font. A swap period where it says show fallback, now show me the downloaded font. Or a failure period where what happens if the font doesn't download at all. And there are 5 values we can put in our CSS, and we just put them in our font face declaration there: auto, block, swap, fallback, or optional. So how do these work? So we have like invisible text, right, where we can't see anything. We have fallback, where we can see the default font on the operation system, and then we have the custom font. So block works like this. It blocks the download for 3 seconds. It then shows the fallback, and then it goes to custom. I don't know why you would ever use that. It seems like an anti-pattern to me, because you're blocking your text for 3 seconds, and that's a long time. Yeah. Swap, just straight to fallback. Once it's downloaded, it swaps in the custom font. Fallback will start for 100 milliseconds. It'll look for the font, for the custom font, and then go straight to fallback. Okay, and then it will download the custom font. And optional will go, yeah, whatever, I don't know which one is first. Yeah. So you specify that in your CSS, and your font handling will then happen that way. This I highly recommend using swap, show fallback text, then swap that out for your custom typeface. It's good, reasonable browser support. It doesn't work in IE, not surprising, but that's okay because it's progressive enhancement, yeah, and IE will show a fallback by default, so that's built in. Okay, so the future of fonts, yeah, variable fonts. Has anyone heard of these? Okay, so it's an entire typeface in one file. So now we might have, so we can have a continuous range of design variants in our one typeface. So this is an example, Roboto. You might have all those different styles, light, extra bold, italic, etc., etc., etc. And usually those would be mapped to separate font files. And if you want the entire Roboto family, you need to go and load in every single one of those font files. You should, obviously, for performance reasons, you should never be doing that. So variable fonts, this is the font tool in Illustrator. And there's a new thing there, if you've ever used Illustrator, in the character panel. And it looks like that. And when you click on that, it gives you little sliders to change the weight, width, and slant of this particular font, Acumen Variable Concept. And you'll notice that we have values that we don't normally have, like a weight of 194.29. In CSS at the moment, for weight, we have values of 100, 200, 300, up to 900. With variable fonts, we have values from 0 to 999. And the same with width and the same with slant. So variable fonts, we can use them now. They're supported in a lot of browsers. Edge, Chrome, Safari, Firefox. And we just load them up like we normally do in our font face, except we have WOFF to variations as our format, okay, which is straightforward. And we might load to one for regular, one for italic. Sorry, normal, one for italic. Or if you're familiar with CSS supports, you can use CSS supports. Has anyone used CSS supports? CSS supports says, like, does this browser support this CSS feature? If it does, then use this CSS. If it doesn't, then just ignore this block. So you can use that. Of course, the problem with it comes with browsers that support variable fonts but don't support supports, if that makes sense. You've got a problem then, yeah. Safari being a case in point. And then you just use it as your normal font family, which is nice. And we've got 5 values here that we can change in our variable fonts. Weight, stretch, optical sizing, italic, and oblique and angle. And those are specified, this is part of the specification. But any type designer can add any variation of their choosing. Okay? And it just becomes part of the font file as a new OpenType feature. So we've got all our ligatures and our alternates and our stylistic sets. We now have these variations as well as part of the OpenType font format. And we would write them like that. This would say, make my weight 850, make my width 100, and make my italic 1. Okay, and it's a CSS property, font variation settings. Okay, this is a low-level setting. It will become like this: font weight, font stretch, font style, etc. But that's not supported in browsers. This one is supported in browsers as of now. So, quickly, let's have a. This is a variable font. I'm just going to open my inspector. And if you don't use Firefox, you should use Firefox for fonts, because they have this little tool here. And you'll see if I scroll down, there's a whole bunch of sliders. And those are all the different variations that we have in this particular typeface. So I'm just going to slide one, and let me try that again. You can see that typeface is now changing with outline. I can make it a rounded slab. Now it's a serif font of sorts. All these types of things that we can add. And you can do them all at once, so you can create these like weird typefaces. Not really recommended, it's more for demonstration than anything else. But what you can do with these is you can animate them. So you can actually animate between variable font settings. So you might, for example, hook into like a scroll action down a page, and as you scroll down, a headline becomes bolder or something like that. Okay. I see people doing a lot of really terrible stuff with this in the next while, so brace yourselves. Because you can doesn't mean you should. But for the first time, we have like properly animatable text. Okay, so here's an example again of using variable fonts. So I went and just took an article written by Jeremy Keith about service workers and stuff, and thought, well, let's lay this out. And I saw something similar and thought this was a good idea. So I just took the exact text and used some grid layout to like lay out an article. Okay, this is using a variable font, but the variable fonts are now off. So I'm going to switch this particular one on, and you can see how everything has now changed. So we had a simple headline is now a much more interesting one, and that's using the same typeface. There's only one font loaded on this page, and here I'm just changing the size, I'm changing the weight, I'm changing the slant to create that. And you can see here spacing. If I switch it off, the spacing changes. If you see down here, it's a simple heading. We can easily change it into something like that. Okay. So variable fonts allow us to have all these different fonts just in one file. And if we follow our performance techniques to load them, because they are slightly bigger than a normal file, obviously, because there's so many in them, but not much, we can start to really improve the performance of our typography. Right, so, quote, web design is 95% typography. Oliver Reichenstein said that in 2006. That was a fairly long time ago. It was kind of pre all the video we see these days. But I think it's still largely true that we largely online to read, and to consume information. We might be looking at things too, obviously, but we do a lot of reading online. And if we can get our typography right, and by right I mean enhance it with OpenType features, choose our fonts correctly, and make sure they're loading well and they are fast, because people will leave your site if it doesn't load. And then start thinking about using variable fonts, because there are loads of them out there. Just Google variable fonts and you'll find a whole lot of sites that are documenting them. And by doing that, we can really improve the way we make experiences readable online, because I think it's quite a neglected area. Yeah. Thanks for listening. Okay. Was I on time?
Any questions?
When it comes to these variable type fonts
Yeah.
that are becoming more and more popular, do you see support coming in for existing fonts that will add that, or is these entirely new
Yeah.
fonts that people will have to switch over to using?
So actually a whole lot of existing fonts are being made variable. Adobe have made quite a few already. So there's a bunch of like really standard Adobe fonts that come with Creative Cloud, like Minion and Myriad and so on. They've made those variable. They've got an open source font called Source Sans and Source Serif. Those have been made variable. A lot of them are going that way, yeah. So there are also a lot of new ones as well. And there are a lot of kind of very experimental things at the moment. So things that I don't think will be particularly long-lasting. But yeah, so the variable fonts is an initiative by Apple, Microsoft, Adobe, and Google. So it has massive support. I mean, those are the four like real type. Well, they own the web, don't they? Those four companies. So it's just gonna grow. It's just gonna grow, and it's been adopted as a standard, and it's already in browsers. So it already has good support in browsers, even Edge and whatnot. So yeah, we'll see new ones, but we'll also see existing ones becoming variable fonts. Yeah.
So with variable fonts, the ability to break up the package for buying a font.
Sorry, for
buying a font.
Yeah.
When you buy a font, normally you can kind of break the package and say, I only need the regular,
Yeah.
and the bold and thin. You know, I don't want to buy thin. Do you see that affecting the pricing of fonts?
Yeah, so I've seen a few things where it's come down significantly, but that still needs to play itself out. I mean, fonts are super expensive. I mean, just like buy the whole Helvetica family, it'll cost you like 100,000 rand, you know. So they're very, very expensive. I think the font foundries are going to have to grapple with that. The variable fonts that have come out right now have all been free, yeah. They've all been open source, open font license. But there's going to have to be some kind of a pricing model that happens. But there's no way they can sell it, one variable font for the cost of a family, because no one will adopt it. Yeah, so it'll definitely be cheaper. I don't know how much cheaper though. Yeah, but there's some very good open source ones. Yeah. Any other questions?
Nice. No further questions?
That's the examples I've got are on GitHub. Just search for my name and you'll find them.
Awesome. Thank you,
Thanks.
Justin.
Thanks very much.